This may seem a little odd at first, but bear with me because what I'm going to present today is a precursor to what I really think is important. Okay, and it's going to seem in some ways like it doesn't have much to do with the conversations we've had for the last 29 weeks. So you can start it here, Nathan, cut it off and cut all that beginning off. So I want to ask a series of questions that I really don't want immediate answers to. These are the things that I want you to be thinking about through what we're talking about today. So first, do you have faith? Secondly, can you define faith without using the word belief? And why do you have faith? And I thought of another one that I didn't get up on the screen. I thought of it this morning. Does belief in God equal faith? Okay? And I think we're going to see the answer to these and how they're woven into what we talked about over the last few months. I want to start with this. Back in 1969, before anybody here was born, I spent my first year of college at Central Michigan University. As with most church-going young people at that time, college became the first time my faith was ever challenged. Okay? I remember talking about with the kids in school, but it wasn't where it was challenged to the point where I really had to think about anything specifically. What I remember most, other than the Vietnam War riots on campus and the 1,000 people in a snowball fight on campus, what I remember more than even those kinds of things are two statements that were made by two different people that I barely knew. One was a young lady, and the other one was a history professor. Okay, first of all, the world history class that I took at CMU had about 80 people in the lecture hall. And we were discussing historical evidence that surrounded the New Testament time period of the Bible. We weren't talking about the Bible, we were talking about that particular time period. The instructor made this comment. As a historian, Luke could be trusted, but Luke's historical accuracy is impeccable. Luke had a problem, though, being too charismatic. Now, what he meant, what was implied by the idea that Luke was too charismatic was when he mentions his historical facts, he's right, but then he gets into all this hippie stuff like miracles and things, which he thought was just nonsense. So, how could Luke have one side and then the other also when he didn't believe in both of those? Therefore, Luke's historical accuracy was mixed with a bunch of fairy tales and myths. Okay? That came across to me, probably to most everybody else in there. I don't know how everybody else thought about it, but I took it to heart. The second one was a young lady, and at one point there were two students and myself. We had just gotten back from church. There was a lady that would pick a few of us up, take us to church on Sunday morning. And religion came up in that conversation, sitting in one of the group rooms in one of the dorms. During the conversation, the young lady made this particular statement to us. She said, "I wish I had your faith." I remember feeling a certain curiosity when she said that. Her statement made it sound as if I had been given some kind of a gift and somehow she had been left out when faith was being distributed. It almost seemed, at least from her statement, like somehow some people were given this gift of faith and others were not. I found that curious, and those two questions, as I look back, haunted me for a long time. This young lady's statement and the statement made by the history professor got me thinking seriously about my own faith. My mom and dad had become Christians when I was 8 years old, and I had seen what changes it made immediately in their lives. So much so that by the time I was 9, I was baptized. By the time that I went to college, I had heard a bazillion sermons on faith. And every one of them said, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. It was read, it was glossed over, it was given some kind of a meaningless definition, and then moved on. And I remember every time trying to think, what? The adults seemed to all like that, but I wasn't buying it. Not that I didn't think it was true, I just didn't fully understand, I think, what it was he was trying to show. And I'm not sure he knew. Any of the preachers that I heard say this. This verse was etched into my memory at an early age. But what I did not remember is anyone giving answers to the statements made by the young lady at CMU or the history professor that I was in the class of the same year. And I found that troublesome, even problematic. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1 says, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen. We have these two words, assurance and conviction, that should be part of our big picture definition. We're going to talk a lot about those words today on how they relate to some of the things that we've been talking about. It seems to me that in order to be sure or to be convicted of a truth, there must somehow be some past experience that would make it seem true, some kind of evidence. Now, my dad used to tell a lot of jokes that had some subtle meanings, and they weren't always funny, and sometimes he forgot the punchline. But my brother and I learned a lot from my dad's rusty old jokes. One of them he told was about a father that told his son to jump. The father said to the son, come on, jump, I'll catch you. Kid said, no, I don't want to. He repeated it over and over and over. And then finally, the boy jumped. And quickly, the father stepped back and let the boy fall on the floor. Can you see how my dad's not always funny in his jokes?
Yes.
But they do have meanings. You know my dad. Then the father looked down and said to his son, always remember this, don't trust nobody. And that was exactly how my dad would say it. So what was the point? The point was that past evidence determines future trust. Okay? So if somebody says something to you and they don't come through on that promise, it's probably not something that's reliable. There are many reasons sermons preached about faith every Sunday morning, but it seems to me that the definition is often blurry at best. In order to trust in something that much, there should be at least some kind of reinforcing evidence. Now, in science, we see this. We're taught that evidence must be empirical, physical, and experimentally observable. We talked about that in the first part of the class. I learned to trust my dad because he never asked me to jump off a piano and then let me fall. Okay, when he said something, I knew from past experience that I could trust what it is that he said. And I think that's the same way with any kind of what we would call faith. It has to be that way. So, how can we trust in a God that we cannot see? Because science says that empirical evidence only comes through these five senses. Okay? We've either got to be able to see it, hear it, taste it, smell it, or touch it. And which one of those can we do with God? Okay? None of them at the present time. None of us have seen him or heard him directly in any way. And how could you trust in a being that allegedly wrote a book, which a large part of the population claims is full of error and myth? The problem is never addressed in these kinds of sermons. Yet, it seems to beg for an answer. So we've got what I would call kind of a problem going on. After my first year in college, and over the next several decades, I spent a lot of time and material on material pertaining to Christian evidences. Slowly but surely, I came to the conclusion that there must be some kind of intelligence beyond what we see in the human world. That became crystal clear to me, and I taught it here a lot over those years. Over time, the idea of believing in a God became more reasonable to me than believing in any alternative. But knowing that the universe did not happen by chance did not totally bring resolution to the statements made by the young college student and the history professor. There are many people that believe in intelligent design and yet still think that the Bible is a myth. So, let's look first of all at some modern definitions from dictionaries. Now, I want you to notice as I go through, there's going to be 5 different definitions. We're starting with an older dictionary and working our way up to a newer dictionary. And unfortunately, I did this part of this a long time ago, and I don't remember the years that these came from. I wish I did, but I don't. But the first ones that I'm going to show you are the oldest, and the last one I'm going to show you is the newest, more modern definition that you find in a dictionary. First of all, the act of wholeheartedly believing in the existence, power, and benevolence of a super being, of being loyal to his revealed will. Okay, let's look at the next one going forward. Unquestioning belief in something for which there is no proof. Let's go to the next one. An assurance, a promise, a pledge of loyalty. Let's go to the next one. Something that is believed in or adhered to, especially with strong conviction. Last one. The faith, notice the word the in front, the faith is spoken of as the true religion from the point of view of the speaker. Can you see the downward progression in these definitions? Definitions of faith have changed and weakened dramatically over the last few decades. These are the important points. An act of wholeheartedly believing. Now, I think that that's true, but I think it's still wanting in part of its definition. We're going to talk about that. But unquestionably belief with no proof, I think that's wrong. But that is what was never addressed in those sermons as I was growing up when every preacher would teach about faith. Or something to adhere to. But the worst one to me is the faith, using a definite article as if it's the door or the computer or the cat, right? Is spoken of point of view of the speaker. In other words, what's that one's kind of saying? It's kind of like saying everyone can come to their own faith. And you don't have the same faith as anybody else, so it's like, it doesn't really matter what it is. No wonder the young lady I spoke to at CMU those years ago was envious of someone else's faith. She didn't think, I believe, that it was possible, given her circumstances, to attain it. If she didn't have proof, or if she didn't have some kind of personal religious experience or feeling, then it would seem that the faith that she should have was elusive or something that needed to be fabricated. And there's where I saw the problem immediately. And I saw it when I was 9 years old. Couldn't define it then, but I did. The New Testament uses the Greek word for faith 244 times. And this is the word that it uses right here. In it, these are a lot of the possible meanings: persuasion, reliance, convinced by argument. As you look through there is the word belief and that sort of thing in there. But look at the persuasion, the convinced by argument, to persuade, to be persuaded. Okay? That means that there's something else going on with just, I kind of feel that this is right, so I have faith it's going to happen. There's a persuasion going on here. There's evidence involved. And that's what I think that so much is, that I think so much of the time is missing from a lot of the sermons. The implication is that there must actually be some kind of persuasive reason for this kind of trust to be taken place. Trust and confidence do not simply appear out of thin air. Trust and confidence must come through some kind of previously credible, convincing evidence. And some people think that they have had some kind of a personal emotional experience that convinces them that God can be real and he can be trusted. But that's not faith. And we're going to see in a minute, that's not what Abraham and Moses and those guys in Hebrews had. And that's not how it's being described in Hebrews in that verse, if we look at the words more closely. I think also the Bible teaches opposite of that. So I don't think it's true. Instead, it seems like a person must in some way be persuaded that the one they believe in has given them reliable assurance or evidence that they are trustworthy. Previous experience, confidence cannot be gained. Without it, confidence cannot be gained. There's an example. If every time a person gets out of jail, they go back and they rob another bank, then saying that you have faith that they're not going to rob a bank this time when their parole is wishful thinking, but it is not faith. Most translations of Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1, use the words that we talked about just a bit ago, the words assurance and conviction, or confidence and insurance. A person's conviction cannot be based on feeling, I don't think. So, this is the King James Version that I originally would have learned it from. Faith is the substance, notice that word, of things hoped for, and the evidence of things not seen. And if you look at those original words, that is one of their primary meanings. Okay? But in the modern translation, those words have been changed. The New American Standard, another old translation, says, faith is the certainty of things hoped for and the proof of things not seen. We're going to talk about those as we go through. So the substance is kind of like the stuff you see. And the evidence is kind of like the stuff you investigate, if you think about it that way. So what is it that we can not see that we think is true, that we have evidence for, thinking that it's going to happen? That's the way I look at that. The word translated substance or certainty is also means persuasion or to convince. And the word that's translated proof or evidence means a clear, open, public evidence. One of their primary meanings. When gaining trust or strong belief in something, there needs to be a certain amount of clear evidence for that to take place. But does this kind of definition hold true about biblical faith? Some would say no. I've heard it said that way in Bible classes. And the more modern dictionary definitions of faith seem to agree that that's true, that we don't need it. But I believe that they're wrong. And let's take a look at some things from Hebrews to show us. So we know that by faith Abel offered, Noah built. Abraham left his country, sojourned, and offered sacrifices, offered his own son. Moses refused to believe what the Egyptians were telling him. He forsook, he kept, and he walked through the sea. These are all words that are used in the book of Hebrews. Hebrews never tells us that any of them simply had a feeling. In fact, they all knew that God existed. They knew this firsthand. And that's where I had another place where I had a problem. We can't see God, but they had faith, so we're going to have the same kind of faith. Well, they actually saw God firsthand, okay? They saw him on the mountain. They saw him in the Red Sea. They heard him speak in a burning bush. They had evidence I don't have. So how can I make that transition? That's a problem for some people. It was for me for a long time. All of the great Old Testament men and women of Hebrews chapter 11 acted on their faith because they had evidence of who God was. We know, for instance, that Abraham knew who God was because he had experienced God firsthand. God talked to him, and Abraham directly responded to God. Abraham had hard evidence. But we are told that Abraham had these things by faith. So it can't be the fact that he didn't see God that he had to have faith. He saw God and it said he still had faith. Okay? So we have to be able to, I think, mix that with what we have nowadays for evidence, or we can't, at that point, if we can't, then I don't think we can have the faith of Abraham. I think that point is missed too often. So we might ask, what was it that Abraham had faith that God would do? Okay, that's the next step. Abraham received promises from God all the way back to Genesis chapter 12. He said, you're going to have a great nation. I'm going to bless you. I'm going to make your name great. Those who are on your side, I will bless, and those that oppose you, I'm going to curse. The earth will be blessed because of you. I will give you a son, and through you the promised seed will come, and the world will be blessed. These are all important. Some of these promises began to materialize while Abraham was still alive. Abraham began to become wealthy. And when even in his nomadic life, he didn't own any property and any land, but still he gained riches and respect. And those that cursed or did wrong by Abraham had to answer to God. That happened right during Genesis. So some of these actually started to transpire, and Abraham saw that happen. God had made promises. Not all of them were kept, but some of them were throughout the rest of his lifetime. It seems that Abraham's faith was strengthened throughout his entire life. Yes, he and Sarah at times both had doubts. We can see that easily from the scriptures. It wasn't until Abraham was 100 years old, 25 long years after God promised him a son, that he finally had Isaac. There are numerous examples of God's providence towards Abraham in the book of Genesis. God gave Abraham many trustworthy reasons to believe in him. The first part of Hebrews 11:1 says, faith is the substance of things hoped for. Something that is hoped for is a thing not yet owned. So, for instance, I can hope for a camera that I do not own, but I cannot hope for a camera that I already possess. So if Abraham already had this substance where he could actually see God to see it happen, then how could Abraham have faith? That was always my question that nobody could answer. Hebrews chapter 11 verse 10 says, Abraham was looking forward to a city that has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. And I think that's part of the crux of the matter. Because of past evidence, Abraham saw that God was trustworthy. He could believe in the things that God said were future, which were some things like the seed, which is important. But specifically, Hebrews is telling us that he was looking forward because of that faith that he saw God showing evidence in, that there was a city whose foundations and whose builder and maker was God. We should ask, what city is Hebrew referring to? Of course, we know on this side of the cross which one it should be. So how did Abraham, back in the Old Testament, have any idea of God's promise of a place in heaven? Somehow he did. We're not given privy to that specific piece of information, but he did, because Hebrews says so. Abraham could not understand God's whole plan. I'm convinced of that. For instance, it's difficult to see for sure how much he knew about the promised seed. He may have thought it was Isaac, just like I think Eve may have thought it was her first son, but it wasn't. Okay? Noah's dad kind of thought maybe it was Noah. There's evidence to that in the book of Genesis also. And I'm not sure we know if Abraham could have conceived of a place whose streets were made of gold. Because that's a New Testament verse, and Abraham didn't have that. And we know that Abraham believed in a city that he could never physically see, a city that would be built by God himself. So there was some kind of a hint to that we're not told. But that means that Abraham was believing or having faith in God to the point where he was believing in some things that he could not yet see. God gave Abraham evidence of his power and majesty. He saw firsthand how God's promises came true in his life. And therefore, in Abraham's eyes, the evidence was tilted in God's favor, and Abraham had faith that God would deliver on these future things, which is what that verse in Hebrews basically, I think, is saying. We're having faith that God's going to deliver on future things. The promises that these are promises that Abraham could not see. Abraham believed God's words about the future because of the evidence of past experience. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 7 is often quoted in a faith sermon. Abraham was looking forward to a city whose foundations and maker was God.
That's a good one.
Okay, guess what? I was supposed to bring that one up back here. I'm up here. So we're going to bring up 2 Corinthians now. For we walk by faith, not by sight. On the surface, and in most of the sermons I heard when I was growing up, it sounds like Paul is telling Christians not to look for evidence. That's a surface meaning, and I think it's wrong. On the surface, that's what it sounds like. But like all Bible verses, it must be taken in context. This passage is not telling us that faith is blind. Instead, Paul tells Christians, don't get so caught up in this world that you forget about the next. This is exactly, I think, what we are being told about what Abraham did. He looked forward to that city that he knew must exist based on previous reliance on what God presented as evidence. Now, if we went into detail, we can find that the same was true with Abram, the same was true with Noah, the same was true with Moses. Like, for instance, Moses, according to chapter 2, verses 8, 9, and 10, it said that the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take the baby to the mother, etc., etc., etc. So what happened? Moses was snatched up before he could realize anything. He was too young. He was just an infant. And what happened to him over time after that? It is probable that Moses had been told stories about Abraham and the things that Abraham done and by his own mother because of this verse. He would have been told about the things that Abraham had wished for and the things that Abraham had seen through his own eyes and ears of the existence of God, and that God kept his promises. We do know that later in life, Moses did have the opportunity to experience God himself firsthand. God spoke to Moses in the bush, and Moses was the first man to be actually given, according to what we know from the Bible, God's real name. Okay, I am that I am. Moses was also given privy to a lot of information about what was going to happen to the Egyptian army and the Egyptian nation, the plagues. He knew about them ahead of time. Every step of the way, Moses was directed by the very words of God. Egypt was pounded by this God of Abraham that he had learned about as a child, to the point that they were crippled. Moses witnessed a bunch of sheep herding slaves walk defiantly out of Egypt. Um, uh, the most powerful nation on earth, because God said that was going to happen. He walked through water. He had lots and lots of evidence. And if Moses had faith, like Hebrews tells us, then what was there in the future that Moses believed would happen? Okay? Because I think Moses had direct evidence that there was a God, but it says he had faith. So what did he have faith in? I believe that the reward which Moses looked forward to was the same reward that Abraham looked towards. It was God's promise of a seed, the son spoken of throughout the entire Old Testament since the beginning of Genesis chapter 3. And how do we know this? Because the Hebrew writer in 11:26 says this, and Moses considered the reproach of Christ to be of value, more value than the riches of Egypt. Somehow he knew about that future promise that was going to happen. It's not made truly apparent in the Old Testament, but somehow he knew that. Hebrews is telling us that's true. Now, did he see it through the sacrificial system? Did God tell him this? I don't know. Okay? But the Bible's not lying, I don't believe. Because he was looking forward to his reward. That was the reason he could. To me, this is very similar to, probably the same thing as what we're talking about in Abraham, looking to a city whose builder and maker is God. And that son, that this reproaching Christ, this idea of this future son is linked in both cases, and in the other cases, I believe in Hebrew, to whatever this reward is. And it makes it very clear as to what that reward is when we talk about Abraham, because it gives us that specifically. If Moses had faith, like Hebrews is telling us, then what was it that he had faith in? And I believe this is telling us what it was that he had faith in. So it was always about belief in the Son. I think from the very beginning. I think that's why Genesis 3:15 is put in there, to give us the first hint. And if any of you that remember my study in Genesis, we crescendo all the way through Genesis with the more and more and more and more and more, an unbelievable amount of hints of the promised son by the time you get done with Genesis. And then it just continues on through the rest of the Old Testament. It is salt and peppered everywhere through there, until we finally get to the prophets, when they make direct statements as to exactly what the promised seed was going to do. The whole Old Testament, like I said, over and over and over again, everything in the Old Testament is about the Son, and it points towards the cross. And if we read it any other way, like we mentioned before, whether it's like a phone book or encyclopedia just to look up verses, we're looking at the Bible the wrong way. So, at the base level, all people of God, whether it's in the Old Testament or the New Testament, have the exact same hope. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 27 says, he endured as seeing him who is invisible. And this is talking about Moses. The young, wait, I got Young's literal down here, and I got NIV here, so I think it's this one. Young's literal translation says, by faith Moses left Egypt behind, not having been afraid of the wrath of Pharaoh, for as seeing the invisible one, he endured. Moses witnessed firsthand just how powerful the great I Am really was in comparison to all the other gods at the time of Egypt. That is what fueled his faithful service to God all the rest of his life. So, here's one of my points. Is that these men of faith did not simply wake up one day and whimsically decide to follow God follow a God that they had never known anything about. They did not make some irrational decision or some decision that's based on a feeling in order to believe in something that other people would think was a myth or had no proof. They did not pledge their loyalty to a God because of something that they felt in their heart was true because they had a feeling. These men all had evidence. God always gives us evidence, which has been my point in this whole class. Isn't that what Hebrews 11:1 is saying, is trying to tell us? I think that the older Bible translations are correct here. All right? They say, now faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. I think those words are more correct than some of the more modern translations. Faith is knowing that things hoped for and things not seen are actually real because we have evidence from the one who made the promise. All of these men of faith, in one way or another, had some kind of evidence that led them to believe God when he told them about the invisible things that are not physical, or things that are spiritual, and future things, the things that we hope for, like the city, things that we cannot see because they are of another reality other than flesh and blood. They are not three-dimensional. They are future things. They are spiritual. You might be thinking, but how can I obtain evidence about an invisible God so that I can believe in his promises? He no longer destroys cities like Sodom and Egypt in front of my very eyes. He has never talked to me in a burning bush, nor has he told me about his son direct, that I was going to have a son 25 years into the future, or didn't allow me to walk through water. Okay? And I think those are fair questions, and they need to be asked by every Christian. From time to time, from the time I was 20, for about the next 20 or 30 years, I thought the best way to obtain that evidence was through Christian evidences, and that's why I studied it so much. If I could prove there was a God in my own mind, then everything else would fall into place. When I got done with that quest, I found out that's not the end of the quest. Okay? That was only the beginning. Knowing the flaws and weaknesses of the theory of evolution, I think, are important. The very things that we discussed in the first part of this class are important. They're external evidences. But they only take you so far. We have seen that that there is a lot of outside evidence that shows that sort of thing. And I think that's what Romans is pointing to when it says this. For ever since the creation of the world, God's invisible nature, namely his eternal power and deity, have been clearly seen in the things that have been made. I believe wholeheartedly in that verse. But I don't think that verse takes us into that next realm, at least directly. Probably indirectly, but not directly. But as important as these kinds of beliefs in intelligent design are, it only takes us so far. There are many people today who believe, like we've said before, in an intelligent universe and still do not believe in the God of the Bible. And therefore, in order for us to base our faith in the God of the Bible, it seems that we need to be privy to some of the other kinds of evidence that we've been talking about. What is it? Back to Romans chapter 10, it says, faith comes by hearing the word of God. When I was younger, I had a problem with that. It wasn't that I didn't think that was true. I didn't have what I felt was a good enough definition why I should believe that. Okay? And the reason is, if everybody's saying that the Word of God is a myth, then how can I know that the Word of God's not a myth and then be able to take it as in faith that that's being said it's true? And that is what the whole second part of this course has been about. And I didn't go into as much detail as I thought. I mean, there's a lot more evidence, I think. Well, we have to look to the internal parts of the Bible to find out whether or not it's telling the truth. And we did that through historical things, in archaeological things, in medical things, in the idea that the cities and the people and the nations that it talks about all really exist, that the Bible comes up many times, tells us that there's a nation, people don't think it's there, and then the Bible's proving true. One after another, there is evidence in there that that Bible is telling us the truth. And when we get to the New Testament and it starts talking about Jesus and the apostles, what they did, it's not some thing that this history professor thought was a myth or he was too charismatic. There's evidence that what he said had to be true. And that, I think, is where our faith should be based. But it takes a journey to get there. It's not something I think you can just accept without any kind of investigation. And I think too often people do that and they have somebody challenges, they have no idea what to say next. And I find that to be, in some ways, sad. So, how or where do we get the evidence we need to develop this kind of faith? How are we to be persuaded? Again, let's go back to Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. And it says, in many and various ways God spoke of old to the prophets, to the fathers by the prophets, but in these last days he has spoken to us by a Son, who he has appointed heir to all things, through whom also he created the world. And we know that he's talking about Jesus in that passage. God spoke directly to men like Abraham and Moses. And then beginning with Samuel, he talked to Israel through the prophets. But we find out in John chapter 1 that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. That's where we got the next words from, directly from God himself in the form of a Son, in the form of a fleshly man. This passage is talking specifically about Jesus and the promised seed. The one who became flesh and blood and came down to earth for the very purpose of speaking to mankind directly. The apostles heard Jesus speak, and that's important. They saw him do marvelous works, and that is important. They are the witnesses. So we have to decide whether or not we believe the witnesses. And as we went through in the second part of this class, especially the last half of that, the last 3 or 4 weeks, we found that their witness is pretty doggone reliable. Is it proof positive? The answer is no. But we're looking for overwhelming evidence. And I think for myself now, the overwhelming evidence points to the fact that there is enough things out there that shows me that that stuff has to be true. Okay? The apostles heard Jesus speak, and they saw him do marvelous works. And they saw him rise from the dead and ascend back to the Father. So again, what about us? What evidence do we have? In John chapter 5, the Jewish leaders questioned Jesus about his authority. Remember what Jesus answers? It's a long chapter. And there's a long, I don't remember how many, it's at least 30 or 40 verses where he gives that answer. He says that the answer includes such things as his works that he did, John the Baptist, what he said, pointing to Jesus, the Father himself that came down, pointing to Jesus, put a dove on his shoulder. The Old Testament scriptures spoke about him. Moses spoke about him. And then throughout the rest of the New Testament, we find out that there's a lot of other evidence that's placed on us throughout the entire Old Testament, over and over and over again. Jesus said, no, I don't have that slide. Moses, the prophets, well, it's just really a low list of all these. We got all of these different kinds, and there's more. Our quest for truth must include a curiosity about who is responsible for all of this intelligent design. I think that's true. I spent a lot of time at that. But it must also include an honest examination for the clues and the evidence of witnesses that are found in the Bible. And that's what we tried to do in the second part of this class. What happened to the apostles? We already talked about that last week, I think it was. These men went around teaching and writing about what they saw Jesus do and what they heard Jesus say. They told what their eyes saw and what their ears heard. They wrote them down for future generations. They were the witnesses. And one of the most important things, I think, is the fact that they died for that belief. They didn't fall apart. They didn't say, well, this is getting too hard. I'm going to tell you that this really didn't happen. We stole the body. All right? That never happened. In doing so, they attested to the fact that this same Jesus was the same one predicted in the Old Testament. He was the promised seed. He was the Son. He was the Messiah. He was Jesus the Christ. They witnessed the resurrection. All of the Old Testament prophets finally made sense to them. One by one, they were martyred for what they believed, and yet they still didn't change. So, when we read the Bible, we see that historically, in geography, the science, everything is all correct. And when we view the wonders of the universe, we find that the words that we read about creation is more than likely how it was done. That it was done by the promised seed, along with the Father, this man from Nazareth, that some claim to be only a human being. The apostles and the New Testament writers stand as witnesses, and we need to be able to learn to trust those witnesses. Like I said before, faith is not blind. It is not a leap into the great unknown. Faith is not wishful thinking or a feeling, nor is it something that we develop from within ourselves. I believe that faith is conceived in evidence, and that God has made us privy to an overwhelming amount of this evidence. It's subtle. It's not always easily seen, but it's powerful once you understand it. The young lady that I sat and talked to that Sunday morning at CMU was envious of the faith others had, but she misunderstood the very nature of the faith that she was envious of, and did not think it was something that she could attain. And my first year history professor, listen to this carefully, had all of that evidence that he needed right in front of him, and he ignored it. Evidence from this physical world is meant to nudge us in the direction of belief in a creator. But evidence from God's word is meant to nudge us in the direction that shows us who this creator is and what he has promised, and that his promises are true. And the sum total of all of this evidence is meant to compel us to believe in the true spiritual reality that transcends what we presently see. Like it says in, skip that one too. Like it says in Romans 10:17, so faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. Those preachers years ago used this a lot, and they were right. I've come to the conclusion that that verse is correct. But my problem was they didn't go into the detail that showed me why. And I'm hoping that this class has done that. Showed you why there are reasons to believe. From God's first spoken words during creation to the words spoken by the prophets, and finally and foremost the very words that are spoken by the Son, we have our evidence. This is the nature of faith, I believe. And because we believe the evidence God has given us, we have the same hope for the future as Abraham did. We look forward to a city whose builder and maker is God.